From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is Openline.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Openline. Glad you are with us tonight. It is Tuesday, August 31st of 2021, the last day of August in 2021. We are talking about the end to America's longest war. So America is now officially out of Afghanistan. President Biden spoke about that today. And so we're going to talk about it. What are your thoughts? This is certainly something that rightfully so is getting tons of attention, tons of different thoughts on it. And we'll be talking with Thomas Schwartz, Vanderbilt Political Science Professor. And he's joining us via Zoom, as our guests are now. Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program.
So you've watched everything. Your thoughts this is historic. It's very historic. There's been certainly criticism about how it's handled. There's some on both sides who said we should have done it a while ago. There's some who say this was a sloppy, it was handled poorly. But what are your thoughts, big picture now, about this, what's happening in Afghanistan?
Well, it's hard. We're so close, it's hard to say anything. I confess that hearing the president call the evacuation an extraordinary success made me wonder what failure would look like. This has not been, I can't imagine the idea of the United States being driven out of Afghanistan by the Taliban 20 years after we went in there, after the Taliban had sheltered the person who attacked and caused the largest loss of life for the United States in its history on a single day. At 9/11, that's pretty hard. That's a pretty hard thing to accept. I think that this is a tough day to look at as successful. We've left some Americans behind. We've left a lot of Afghans who helped us behind. I'm hoping that the Taliban is not as vicious and as thuggish and as criminal as they were in 1990s when they killed people for playing music or for playing jokes or for women for wearing their hair wrong or showing signs of that. So I certainly approach this with a great deal of sadness and the future with some trepidation for what it means.
Biden has gotten a lot of criticism for leaving Americans behind. That was the initial thing that the Republican Party sent out, that he has left Americans behind. He said today, the bottom line, 90% of Americans in Afghanistan who wanted to leave were able to leave, and for those remaining Americans, there is no deadline. We remain committed to get them out if they want to come out. He said the administration has reached out to Americans in the country multiple times, at least 19 times or something. What about those who are, I read that and it's almost contradictory. 90% of Americans in Afghanistan who wanted to leave were able to get out. And then he's saying, he reached out to them 19 times. Who are these Americans that are left behind there? What do you know?
Well, the collapse happened very suddenly. And there were lots of Americans involved in working with Afghans. A lot of them did get out, but the chaos of the evacuation, especially what happened after the 14th and 15th when Kabul fell, did create real complications for getting Americans out. Now it may be the case that we got 90% out. I confess that I don't know exactly where these numbers come from and what they're based on, given the difficulties they've had in estimating in the past. But it seems to me he's trying to make an excuse there, also saying that we contacted them 19 times and they didn't listen to us. But things happen much more rapidly. And he himself said that he would not leave anyone behind. In an interview that he gave not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, he said, I'm not going to leave anyone behind. He kept to the deadline. He kept to the August 31st deadline that he said that he would not keep to if there were Americans there. So in a way, he's trying to have it both ways on that one.
Yeah. And I like talking to you as a historian. So political science, we can talk about the politics of it all, and we'll certainly do that, I'm sure. But the history of it all, this was our longest war. How will, and it is tough to, we're, a day out. How will this be viewed? I guess put this in context of our nation's history and the wars it's fought, what kind of stands out to you?
Well, this was our longest war, chronologically, but it was certainly not our costliest war. Certainly, we spent a lot of money because, of course, the scale of what we buy and the weapons we use, but we lost 2,500 men. We're all tragic, 2,500 men and women, actually, I should say. We lost, that is, by standards of our war, that's relatively low, certainly by the standard of Vietnam, Korea, or the two world wars or the Civil War. It's more along the lines of what we lost in the War of 1812 or the Mexican War back in the 19th century. It's a relatively low casualty war. Obviously, there were a lot of men also, men and women both also injured in the war. There were thousands also of Afghans lost. So the war was long chronologically, but it was episodic. The Taliban didn't fight in the winter, for example. They would go to Pakistan and winter in Pakistan rather than fight during the winter. So the chronology of the war, the length of the war, is not necessarily correlated to its overall bloodiness or savagery. It took place over a long period of time. It was marked at the beginning by great success. We were able to oust the Taliban government within a month of military operations. They were on the run. And then it dragged on, became a sideshow during the Iraq war, and it became a war that we weren't paying attention to. President Obama came in arguing that it was a war of necessity. He surged troops. We did come up with a total of about 100,000 in the early 2010s. But then we withdrew again. We scaled down the war. And so we were down to some 2,500 men there now at the beginning of the year, a relatively small scale military commitment that President Biden then ended.
Do you think it makes us less safe? It's certainly kind of disconcerting to see clearly the Taliban taking over. As our plane is leaving, they're kind of walking in, heavily armed, taking over. So we fought against the Taliban for 20 years, and now we leave and they just take over. And if our concern was that would be an area where they could train and they could move forward with attacks, how concerned are you about our safety now that the Taliban has Afghanistan?
Well, I'm not directly as concerned that the Taliban will attack. But the Taliban, remember that the reason we went in there was the Taliban provided shelter to al-Qaeda. It had sheltered Osama bin Laden. And it now has other terrorist groups that are there, some of which it opposes, like the ISIS-K group that set off the bomb that killed the 13 American soldiers. But Afghanistan itself could become a place where terrorist groups gather or work because the Taliban is tolerant of them, or at least encourages them. So it might not be the Taliban itself that carries out the attacks. It's maybe the other groups that obtain shelter there that will carry out attacks on American interests and perhaps even the United States, as they once did.
And this was a time to really make a decision, right? I mean, I guess that's what President Biden is saying. We have to decide if we're just going to stay there forever or if there is an end point. And I believe he argued we did what we went there to do when we killed Osama bin Laden 10 years ago. And certainly he was hoping, I believe, that the people of Afghanistan will be able to fight a little better and longer and harder, and they certainly weren't able to. But as far as, foreign policy doctrines and that kind of thing, what would it mean? What does it mean, in your opinion, that we left? What would it have meant if we stayed? And do you agree this was a time where we were going to make a decision that would really impact whether we're nation building or that kind of thing?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that's President Biden presenting it as that he had to make that decision. There was no reason why he had to make that decision. He chose that decision because of his own conviction, I think, that the war needed to be ended. He could have easily rejected the agreement Donald Trump had made. He rejected other agreements Donald Trump made, and he has reversed other policies. That was not. I think that's clearly a contrived argument on the part of the president. He wanted to end the war. He wanted to end it at the 20th anniversary of 9/11 initially, but he set an arbitrary deadline that I don't think was essential. I think he could have waited for example, into the winter. He could have waited longer until other things had transpired. So I think this was this was clearly the president's decision. He wanted to end the war and end it as soon as he could on this basis of getting Americans out on an arbitrary deadline. So I think on that. Now, what does it all mean? I think it does seem to signal that the United States is pulling back from its role as a world stabilizer, as a power that's active in countries, and it certainly casts doubt on the legitimacy or the credibility of our commitments. We have left behind lots of people who believed in us, and essentially you could make the case that people should not believe the United States when it asks them to do something, because the United States is quite willing to just go home and abandon them. And in that sense, I think our credibility has taken a hit. And I think this is part of a larger view that the United States should devote more of its time and attention to its own concerns. Nation building at home, as President Obama called it. But I think that's what's historically, I think this is a part of a type of, I want to call it a neo-isolationist, but really a rejection of the type of outward foreign commitments that 9/11 occasioned, particularly.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I've heard that it means we can't, people may not be able to count on America. But at the same time, America was there for 20 years, and America spent, according to Biden, $300 million a day. And so I wonder, so we're going to hear from both sides. Politically, what do you think this means for President Biden? And there's a lot of other stuff to talk about, but politically now, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the political horse race. What do you think this means? Certainly there's been criticism from both sides, some stinging criticism, but in the end, we're going to be out of that war. What do you think that means going into midterms and when he goes up for re-election?
I don't know. On the one hand, obviously, it has taken a toll on his approval rating. He has dropped a little bit. But these things are transitory. He could pop back up. He could get a boost from successfully carrying through some of his domestic legislation. I personally think that it has damaged him. Part of his image was this idea of someone who would restore a certain degree of competence in the White House, that he would do things effectively. And this withdrawal was not, no matter how you spin it, just getting out lots of people, the chaos that was involved, the fact people were latching on to the U.S. planes to get out. That chaotic image, I think, will stick with people, along with the fact that we lost 13 of our soldiers in the withdrawal because of suicide bombing, because we did not have a secure place. We had given up Bagram Airport. So I think the argument that this was done effectively, that they anticipated everything, that spin, that really strikes me as trying to make paint the lipstick on a pig type thing. It's really not a very effective way. And I think that damages some of the image of competence and reliability that Biden had attempted to project. I still think, the country is very polarized. Let's face it, people who support him probably will stay supporting him. People who don't like him will stay don't like him. But if there is a degree of independence, I think they may be affected by some of what has happened.
I think one thing Biden has said is, my predecessor, President Trump, wanted out of Afghanistan. This is not a uniquely Democratic or President Biden thing that both sides have said to some degree, let's get out. So does that translate, or I'm interested in what you said, that it was done so sloppily that it kind of dings him on the competence thing, which was important for him. But the fact that now we're out, is that a popular thing, or it could be overshadowed?
Well, both presidents certainly said they wanted out. But on this issue, this was more of a rhetorical one. Americans as a whole did not feel passionately, at least to the extent we can see it in demonstrations or public opinion polls. This was not an issue that gripped people with a great deal of intensity. Yes, they wanted out. If you ask a person in a poll, do you want to fight a forever war, they're going to say no. But when you start withdrawing the way we did, and when you think about what might be the consequences of that withdrawal, for example, today you had images coming out of the Taliban carrying out summary executions or gunfire. You're going to have images perhaps of women being repressed or killed. This is going to be a slow drip of atrocity stories possibly coming out of Afghanistan. And with each one of those stories, you get the idea, well, these were people who relied on the United States, and look what's happening to them now. So I do think that could have an effect. People might think foreign policy, yes, we want out, but if the consequences come to be seen in the way they are being reflected or could be reflected, I think you might see a lot of people sort of say, well, I wanted out, but I didn't want out that way. I didn't want to go out that way and leave so many people behind that would be then vulnerable to the Taliban. So I'm not so sure that the polls and even the fact that Donald Trump favored it is going to necessarily remove the political sting if you see the types of things that might happen with the Taliban in charge in Afghanistan.
Boy, that is a disturbing thought, that we could see those images kind of playing out over and over. Okay, let's go to the phones here. Let's go to Rob, who is on the line. Hello, Rob. Hello, Rob. Go right ahead.
Yeah, long story short, all I can say, this is probably the biggest debacle I've seen in my history as far as getting people out. It seems like nobody had their game plan ahead. When you leave all that kind of military equipment behind, it's like we're retreating. I thought we was the superpower, and we're supposed to tell them when we want to get out, when we're going to get out, have our, support. And if it was Trump, I'd be saying the same thing. Right. I don't care who it was, but that's my opinion. This is one of the biggest. And my question is, how many civilians are left behind? Australians, British, and all that's left behind with their copy of their passports and all that they're looking for. Anyways, I'll hang up and thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Do you know the answer to that question specifically about civilians?
No, there's no. There are a lot of people, though, remember, this was a NATO exercise. The whole Western alliance was actually in Afghanistan in one of the rare moments of unity. And so there were a lot of foreigners, Australians, Canadians, French, German. So there are a lot of people subject to possible kidnapping, to being used as hostages of one sort or another. The other point that the caller made that I think is excellent is the scale of U.S. Equipment and materials left behind, which was not something. It's not something you necessarily want to do, to have Afghanistan now become one of the best equipped armies in that part of the world because of all the American equipment they have.
I did see some video of that. Again, the plane leaves, and then the Taliban's walking through the airport, and there are all these helicopters or whatever was left behind. Why did that happen? Why did we do that?
Well, it was a product of the speed with withdrawal. We couldn't get everything out. We couldn't get all of our equipment, materials out. The deadline was such that you had to make a choice, and the choices were to get people out, not to. Now they supposedly deactivated or made some of the equipment useless. But of course, in other parts of the country, the Taliban have been parading with all sorts of American gear, arms, other things. And so it's clear they did inherit an awful lot of American equipment.
So Rob called this the biggest debacle he's ever seen. How does this compare, again, historically, let's compare it to Vietnam and the exit there. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's not unlike that. The exit in Vietnam took a little bit longer because the South Vietnamese army did fight. It was overrun. It was badly led. But an awful lot of South Vietnamese soldiers fought very hard to prevent the North. But the North was well equipped, much better equipped than the South. And the South did not have American air support because we had denied that to them. And so a lot of equipment was captured by the North Vietnamese as well. There are images, of course, of helicopters being sort of ditched at sea by South Vietnamese crews who were going off to leaving the evacuation at the end. We did leave behind a lot of South Vietnamese who suffered seriously during the and were put into camps and other ways. They were. There wasn't as much a widespread slaughter as many worried, although that did happen, of course, in Cambodia, where more than 2 million people were killed in the aftermath of the war. So, it was a debacle. It was a debacle on, I think, parallel lines with Afghanistan.
And that's not good news for Biden. I mean, Biden said, he was trying to say beforehand it won't be anything like that. But then to have you and others compare it to that is not obviously good news. Let's go to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, hello?
Yes. I have a question that no one has thought of. Okay? Even though that we get these people in the United States, who is to tell them not to come back at us with these people carrying their kids and stuff? The kids can come in and bomb somebody, or the parents, or the men, or the women. Do we know anything about these people that are coming into the United States and not to bomb us or carry out some master plan?
Okay. Concern about the, I guess, the refugees, the Afghan refugees that are coming in on the planes. What about that?
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of these, I think it's one of the sadder aspects that people are already saying this. These people are desperate. They're trying to escape the Taliban. About the most generous thing I can say about that is some of them might resent the United States for abandoning them, but many of them, these are people who were very close to Americans. They wanted to get out because they would be killed because of that. So I'm not particularly worried that they're going to start organizing against us. I think they're going to have enough of a problem sort of dealing with being refugees and the concerns they'll have about their family. I think we ought to be more generous in thinking about them. They've taken a terrible risk, and many of them are going to have to deal with the fact that they left family members behind who might be vulnerable to retaliation because they left.
All right, we will take a break. A lot of calls, so a couple lines open. If you want to call in, we will start going through more calls when we get back. Take a break. Be back right after this.